Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Bhante Metiko, and this is our weekly monk chat session, your weekly opportunity to ask whatever questions you might have about Buddhism. And there's a chance that we might have some answers for you.
They might not be right, but
or they may not be what you're expecting anyway. So whenever you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the comments window. And when the questions dry up, then the monk chat will come to an end. So if you want us to keep talking about Dhamma, then you'll need to keep providing questions. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll start going through the questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Julie, Suzanne, Louisa, Manol, Alyssa, John, Mary, Greg, Thinnery, Yankee, and everyone else who's watching. And so I see one question here, and as more questions appear, we'll respond to further questions. So here, John says, is there a Buddhist theory of long-term memory? Any tips for memorizing suttas in Pali for chanting? Buddhist theory of long-term memory?
So
what does that even? What does that even mean?
There's different types of memory: working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. This is from school. Remembering from school psychology when I worked in a different life. In school psychology, there's measurements of different type working memory. There's different measurements of memory. So I don't know if that's what they're trying to refer to, but I would just say, for me, it's always, and everybody's different. I think in terms of being able to memorize, or for me, it's always just repeating. Chanting suttas during chanting, like that's always helped me. Just having auditory. Some people pick up things just right away. Auditory.
Yeah, I mean it's and maybe John, if you can clarify what you mean by theory of long-term memory, because I'm not quite sure what you mean. But as for tips on memorizing suttas in Pali, I'll actually tell you that the number one biggest aid to memorizing suttas in Pali is to know Pali, as in learn the language. So otherwise, you're just memorizing a series of nonsense syllables. And of course, it's really hard to memorize an arbitrary series of nonsense syllables. Of course, that's challenging. But memorizing words and phrases in a language that you know is much easier. It's not necessarily easy. Again, some people have a very strong and easy memory, and other people it's very difficult. But one thing that makes a tremendous difference is knowing the language. So one thing which actually I did when I was learning chanting, when I was memorizing suttas, is going through whatever I was memorizing and looking up each word in a Pali English dictionary. So I actually knew the meaning of each word. At the time, I didn't know Pali yet, so I didn't know the language, but I at least knew the individual words in the suttas that I was memorizing. And again, that makes a huge difference. And also, you'll find that a lot of it you already know. For example, just now we were reciting the Adittapariyaya Sutta, and in it you find words like dukkha and sukha, and you're like, oh, I know those words. Dukkha, yeah. Sukha, yeah, I know those words. Words like upekkha, and you're like, oh, I know that one. So you'll find you actually already know a lot of words, and you'll also learn a lot of new words, which is also really helpful. So then it becomes an exercise not just in memorizing nonsense syllables, but also in reminding yourself of the Dhamma, and also picking up a bit of the Pali language, which again will help you get a deeper understanding of the Buddhist teachings. As for specific tips for memorizing chanting, one thing which I found useful was to, for example, let's say you have a sutta which is divided up into lines. So a lot of it was poetry, so divided into discrete phrases, discrete lines. So I would read a line on the page and I would say it out loud while reading it. And then I would continue saying it out loud and close my eyes and try to continue saying the phrase out loud with my eyes closed until I could do that consistently. And then I would go to the next phrase in the chanting and do the same thing. Like read it out loud a few times and then close my eyes and try to keep saying it out loud. And in this way, your mind will gradually piece together the whatever it is you're trying to memorize.
That's excellent. Sometimes I would do walking meditation. So I'll walk, look at one line, and then walk with that line and memorize it as I'm walking. The movement has helped me sometimes, like moving with the memorization.
Yeah, I know other monks who have done that, where like they'll have a chanting book with them when they do walking meditation. So they'll be at like one end of the walking path and they'll like read a section of the chanting. And then as they're walking, they'll be reciting that section of the chant. Then they get to the other end of the path, turn around, read the next phrase, and they recite it. So that's another way. So yeah, using walking meditation. I never used that method personally, but I know other monks who got good use out of it. And John says, I've set a goal of memorizing the first 3 discourses. That's nothing. That's nothing. Yeah, I mean, that's a fraction of what I had to memorize as a junior monk. That's not much at all. You can memorize all of that in a few weeks if you wanted to. Yeah, it's not much. You'll also find it's very repetitive. A lot of words and phrases are very similar with only slight changes. So you'll also find that you might think you're memorizing, say, 3 pages worth of material, but actually you're only memorizing about 1 page of material. Once you consider how it's structured with the repetition of phrases and so on. And Bill says, Ayakimavangsi spoke the other day and was accompanied by Ajar Noni. Why is Ajar Noni not in robes or have a shaved head? Well, I didn't personally watch that live stream, but it sounds like Ajahn Noni is in fact not a monk and therefore was not wearing robes or having a shaved head. So this is one thing which is sometimes confusing for people. The word Ajahn in Thai does not only mean monks, it just means teacher.
Right.
So also like if you go to a school or a university, then people will call the teacher Ajahn. So it's not a monastic term. It's just a general term in the Thai language. You were in Thailand recently, I'm sure you saw.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah, actually, I knew a American man who was teaching English as a second language in Thailand for a while, and his students called him Ajahn. Yeah, he wasn't a monk; he was just a layman.
Yeah, it's just teacher.
Yeah, it's from the Sanskrit word acharya, which in Pali is acharya, so very similar words. And then in Thai, that got shortened to Ajahn. Fun fact, the word acharya in Pali literally means assailant, like a person who attacks you, which I find really cute, actually.
Attacks you with wisdom.
Well, the idea is that a teacher is someone who's constantly correcting you and criticizing you and like looking for your flaws to help you improve. But it can feel like you're being attacked. But what they're actually attacking is your flaws and defects.
Your defilements.
Yeah. So I actually found, like, once I found that out, I thought that was really cute.
I do know. I like that.
And Sleep Duck says, in yoga, there are exercises, i.e. asanas, that help one to sit in meditation for longer periods of time? Are there any physical exercises in Buddhism for back strengthening to sit in meditation for longer periods of time? I mean, not that you'll find specifically mentioned in the discourses anywhere, but there are, of course, lots of stretching and physical things you can do that will help your body do periods of sitting meditation. And actually, a lot of things from the yoga asanas can be really helpful. Specifically, anything that's aimed at hips and back. Hips and knees. It's actually not the back that's usually the problem. Usually it's hips and knees. And this is actually directly related to sitting in chairs all the time. If you grew up sitting in chairs and you've been working an office job sitting in a chair for the past 20 years, then you basically taught your body to never sit on the floor in the cross-legged position. So on the other hand, if you grew up sitting on the floor and you also in your adult life spend a lot of time sitting on the floor, then it will be much easier for you. But yeah, you can use yoga asanas that are aimed at hips and knees, and that will help immensely. In the early days of my practice, I did a lot of those kinds of stretches for hips and knees. But after a while, it just becomes unnecessary. And you can use it when you're having specific physical problems. But eventually, if you just keep sitting on the floor all the time, also as much as possible, sit on the floor. Not just during meditation, but like if you're reading a book, sit on the floor. If you're using your computer, well, sit on the floor. Like whatever you're doing, sit on the floor. And you'll find that your body gets adjusted much more quickly. Yeah, avoid chairs. The chairs are a nightmare. And even if you're sitting in a chair, sit cross-legged in the chair. Like just keep training your body through constant exposure. Scott says, from this morning, how is wise attention, yoniso manasikara, supportive to meditation / jhanas, PT? I actually don't particularly like wise attention as a translation of yoniso manasikara. But it's one of those phrases which doesn't translate succinctly very well. But one of the best definitions of yoniso manasikara that you'll find is in the Sabbasava Sutta, so the second discourse from the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha says that there is a yoniso manasikara, which means using the mind unwisely. It's important to point out, by the way, the word yoniso, it gets translated as wise, but that's really not what it means. It actually means based upon the origin. So yoniso manasikara means application of mind. So applying the mind to understand causality, or applying the mind based upon the principles of causality, would be a bit more literal translation rather than wise attention. Manasikara does not mean attention. It means application of mind. So application of mind based on principles of causality, or applying the mind to understand causality. So how's that supportive to meditation practice? Because you're paying attention to how the choices you make either lead to stronger meditation or weaker meditation. So it's observing the causal process, observing the cause-effect process, and seeing what choices lead to better meditation. The Sabbasava Sutta, he speaks about ayoniso manasikara as being, for example, speculating about what you were in the past or what you might be in the future. So that has nothing to do with wise attention or foolish attention, but rather it has to do with applying the mind in a useless way. Useless thinking might be a better word there rather than unwise attention. And then for yoniso manasikara, useful application of mind, so application of mind based on causality. Then he says it's to pay attention to the Four Noble Truths. So observing one's experience of dukkha, observing how desire creates suffering, observing how reducing desire reduces suffering, and observing how following the Buddha's instructions leads to having less suffering. So that's the way to apply the mind, is towards observing the cause-effect process of how we generate either dukkha or sukha, either suffering or happiness. Anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's an excellent way to put it. And also, yeah, I like that a lot.
And Bill says, how do you stay engaged with the practice? I'm getting frustrated because I am hoping the practice will help me be a calmer, nicer person. I don't seem to be making progress. What do you want to say?
First, oh, thank you. First, I would probably abandon that idea of like, this is what I want to be, because when we set those expectations, it's just another idea of self that we're trying to aspire to or live up to. And then that can be frustration. I think I should be this, but I'm not this. So sometimes that can cause a lot of frustration. The other part I would encourage you to look at, sometimes we don't think we've made a lot of progress, but it's helpful to review, like, oh, maybe a month ago I would have acted this way. 2 years ago I would have acted this way. We don't think we're making progress, but when we really reflect on where we're at, we can see the difference. I would also say the path isn't always linear. Sometimes we think, oh, just like lifting weights or, exercising, I started here and then I'm going to be here. It's the straight path. Sometimes the path curves, but the most important thing is we keep those principles. We keep those we keep the precepts. We keep the kindness. Every opportunity, we look for those opportunities of being kind and being calm. And we expand those more and more. We let those grow more and more. And then that won't take us to those places. But having a goal like, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be this type of person, in a way that can always just set you up for failure. Just worry about right now, how can I be kind? How can I become? The other thing I would encourage you is look at, maybe you need to adjust your meditation method. Is it really delivering you or giving you that peace and that calm? Sometimes, I'm obviously a big fan of meditation, the Brahma Viharas. And if you aren't necessarily practicing those, I would encourage you to practice those, because those things, samadhi always helps too in calming the mind and living to those things. So also look into your meditation method. Some meditation methods like constrict the mind.
Great, thank you. And Louisa says, I've noticed in Australia they seem to call monks Ajahn, and here monks are referred to more commonly as Bhante. It's not about where you are in the world, but rather about whether or not a place has a strong connection with Thailand. So again, Ajahn is a Thai title. So if a monastery has a strong connection with Thailand, then they're more likely to use the title Ajahn. So probably the monasteries in Australia that you're referring to are ones that have a strong connection with Thailand. And there's plenty of monasteries here in the US where the monks are called Ajahn. They're the ones that have a strong connection with Thailand. I don't personally have a strong connection with Thailand, and I like Bhante because Bhante is the title that we see most commonly used in the ancient discourses. So when people call me Bhante, it makes me feel a sense of connection with the time and place of the Buddha. So I actually really like that sense of like, oh, this is what people have been calling Buddhist monks since the time of the Buddha. This is what they called the Buddha himself, as well as the Buddha's own direct disciples. So for me, that gives me a powerful sense of connection to the Buddha. Other people, they like being called Ajahn because it gives them a strong sense of connection to this bright, vibrant, living tradition in Thailand. And so that's also perfectly fine. So usually you just call a monk whatever they want to be called.
I'll say it was interesting when I was in Thailand. So other monks said in northern Thailand, they call the senior monks Kruba, younger monks Ajahn, which was different. I'm not used to that.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And Jared asks, what are sankharas? Ooh. I've seen a few different translations for them, and they don't make much sense to me. I'm not surprised. Yeah. This is actually one of those Pali words which is very difficult to translate directly in a single word. If I had to pick a single English word for sankhara, I would probably say thing. That's probably the closest you can get to a single universally applicable translation for the word sankhara, thing. For example, the Buddha said, sabbe sankhara anicca. All things are impermanent. Very clear, very straightforward. Everyone knows exactly what you mean by that. But instead, if you say something like, all fabrications are impermanent, or all formations are impermanent, or all volitional constructs are impermanent, then people start scratching their head like, what the hell is he talking about? Yeah. What the heck is a volitional construct? And what does that have to do with Buddhism? So thing, it means thing. That's the simplest answer. In different contexts, it has more specific meanings. So in some cases, it's specifically talking about mental processes or mental objects. In other cases, it actually does literally mean construct, like in the sense of constructing a building. So sometimes it's actually used in a very literal physical way like that. But generally speaking, when we say the word sankhara, we're usually using it either in its broadest sense, where it means any discrete thing, whether physical or non-physical, doesn't matter. So a cup is a thing. Love is a thing. Joy is a thing. Space is a thing. So all of these are sankharas. All of these are things. And it's, again, the other more specific use is meaning mental objects and processes. And there again, we can use the word thing. We're talking about mental things, mental objects, mental processes. So yeah, thing. Words like formation and construction and fabrication and all of that, I mean, they're okay. They're just kind of clunky and awkward and always require further explanation.
Sound fancy.
Sorry?
They sound fancy.
They sound fancy, but actually one thing I was really struck by is many years ago, I was talking to another monk about translation, and he said to me, never use a $10 word when a 10-cent word would do.
That's good advice.
Yeah. And I was really thinking about that, and I'm like, do we actually really need to use fancy, complicated words for everything? Maybe not.
Just confuses people.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes there really is like some specific word which really pins it on the head.
Right.
But often if we're able to express things in clear, simple words, I usually think that's better.
It is better.
So John says, when a stranger said an insult to me that didn't make any sense, I just froze silently. Should I have at least wished him a nice day? What to do with the repressed anger? Felt like I was hit with an invisible arrow. What do you think?
Well, first I would say, I mean, it's hard sometimes. People say things to us and, it catches us off guard and maybe we don't know what to say. And so I think one is to knowing that, then we let go of these interactions. It's easy to take on what someone says to us and then we just carry it with us and we replay this conversation in our minds over and over and over. I think the most important part is the practice, and just if we practice all the time, if we practice and build up that quality of metta in our hearts, then that's always like our natural response. But sometimes people say things that anger us, or there's that moment of anger, or people say things that hurt our feelings. And this, it's, I think, natural, and also partially being an unenlightened being, we have those things that still sting. We have those things that sting like arrows. The most important part is, you can still wish that person well, even though they're not in front of you, but also wish yourself well. show that same kindness that you want to show to that person, show that same kindness to yourself. But also say that you also don't know what was going on with that person. Maybe that person's suffering as, and that person may have been having a bad day. They may have been in a different place in their mind, and they say something maybe they didn't mean. Maybe that person's at home right now going, man, I wish I didn't say that to that person. I feel bad about it. So we don't know those things. So the most important part is just putting that down, but also, again, showing compassion to yourself, kindness to yourself. But also you can still show compassion and kindness to that person, even though they're not in front of you.
Okay. And Rick says, can you share some reflections on how we can grow in the practice in regard to mind moments? Not clear what you're asking, Rick. So maybe if you could give a bit more explanation or a bit more context, because I'm not clear what you mean by practice in regards to mind moments. So if you can explain that more clearly, then we'll try to answer. So John says, what are some techniques to deal with repeating annoying thoughts? Can we say that thoughts have an origin that can be cut off by a layperson? So yes, all thoughts have origins. Thoughts are conditional phenomena. Another translation of the word sankhara. Actually, that's actually like conditional phenomena. So when I want to use a $10 word, then I say conditional phenomena. 10-cent word, thing. $10 word, conditional phenomena. So yeah, thoughts are conditional phenomena, which means that thoughts arise based upon causes and conditions. So if you want to change the thoughts that appear in your mind, then create the causes and conditions for different thoughts. So for example, repeating annoying thoughts, number 1, stop feeding those thoughts. Number 2, create different thoughts. Or just don't create thoughts at all. But for some reason, that's very difficult for a lot of people.
It is hard sometimes, especially when a thought gets stuck and keeps going. Yeah,
so when you have a thought that seems to just keep coming up over and over again, deliberately create new thought patterns. So actually, this is one place where mantra practice can be really useful. It can be something really short. Like in Thailand, it's very popular just to say Buddha, 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 like just repeating the Buddha's name over and over again. Also very popular in China. Actually, it's the form of Buddhist practice which is most popular worldwide. So the majority of Buddhists around the world, their practice is to repeat the Buddha's name, normally using the Mahayana name Amitabha. So just repeating that over and over in the mind. And it's really incredible how powerful that is. Yeah, it can really just drive out all of those like unwholesome, unpleasant thoughts. And then you're just constantly thinking about the Buddha. There's actually a similar practice from Eastern Orthodox Christianity. For some reason, the Catholic Church didn't like this one and banned it fairly early on, but it's still popular in like Greek Orthodox and in Russian Orthodox and some of the other Eastern Orthodox churches, which is similarly the practice of either just repeating the name Jesus Christ, or they'll use a slightly longer one, like they'll just say like, Jesus Christ, hear me, or Jesus Christ, hear my prayer. And they'll just repeat that phrase over and over and over and over and over and over in the mind. So so mantra practice in its various forms you find in many different religious systems. And of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have a very complex mantra system. Also in Hinduism, they have many different mantra systems. But even just using something simple in your own language, like, may everyone be happy. May everyone be happy. May everyone be happy. Just keep pounding that out over and over and over and over again. And you'll find that your mind starts to change. The old thought patterns start fading away. And you'll find that now the mind has a new repetitive thought, except this one is actually really good. It's very pleasant. You can change the structure of your own mind. And it's done through deliberate effort.
Yeah. I think that's important. You have to put in effort. You can't just, I don't like this. And I like that also, just replacing that thought with a wholesome thought, as you said, Bhante. And then also, I think, as you said, changing the conditions. Sometimes if we notice, oh, when I sit down or when I do this, these thoughts start to come, change that condition. For some people, they get up and do walking meditation, or they might move and sit someplace else or do something different. It's changing those conditions. But yeah, it definitely takes effort. And sometimes reflecting on like just how uncomfortable these annoying the thoughts are. Not focusing on the thought itself, but how uncomfortable it makes the mind. As the Buddha says, wearing. Like, look at the thought as wearing the animal.
Yeah, like if you had a dead snake hanging around your neck. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on that note, the Vitakka Sutta, the Majjhima Nikaya number 20, the sutta on stabilizing one's thoughts, stilling one's thoughts. That's actually a really good.
The Buddha outlines.
Yeah, it gives 5 very potent techniques for, controlling your thinking process. So when Jared says, when a sutta says something like, a noble disciple does X, does that mean if you're unenlightened, you shouldn't do this practice? I've seen Buddhanusati and Marnasati behind this phrase. Well, first off, nowhere in the suttas does it ever say a noble disciple does X. In the suttas, rather, it says an Arya Savaka does X. So we need to know what the term Arya Savaka means. And this is where you'll actually run into some scholarly debates. Because one of the fun things about Pali grammar is that it often allows for multiple translations of any given phrase. So Arya means noble, and Savaka means one who listens. So what's less clear is the relationship between these 2 words. So when you have a compound phrase in Pali, then the relationship between the words and in the compound is not specified. And it's up to the translator to try to figure out, based on context, what the relationship between these words is. So, for example, one alternative translation, which I find usually makes a lot more sense, is a disciple of the noble ones, rather than a noble disciple, because it's like, hey, if you're already enlightened, why do you need to do all these practices? It's kind of like, that's weird. But instead it's like, oh, a disciple of the noble ones, they need to do these practices. So if you take Arya Savaka as meaning disciple of the noble ones instead of a disciple who is a noble one, again, both of these are theoretically accurate translations. If you just take the phrase Arya Savaka by itself, it can mean a disciple of the noble or a disciple who is noble. Either one would be an accurate translation. But through context, we have to figure out which makes more sense. And most of the time, a disciple of the noble ones makes way more sense.
Yeah. That's excellent.
Yeah. So I think that's clearly the case here.
Yeah.
So Thinnery is saying, I have a similar situation as Bill. I'm getting frustrated of where I am in my practice, thinking I have to be a certain way. How do I shift my perspective and be flexible with my mind? Maybe since you answered this before, do you want to take it again? Or I could say some words on the subject.
I'll say a couple words, and then I think your perspective is always valued. Well, actually, we were talking a little bit about this, I think, yesterday. In general, I think people like, in the mind, not people, the mind likes order, likes to know what's going to happen. And so part of the practice is learning how to be uncomfortable sometimes with the unknown and being okay with that. Right now, I don't know. But the most important part, again, as I said, is we practice, we follow the precepts. We practice morality, we practice generosity, which you do those things. With the faith and the confidence that that's going to lead us in the right direction. The Buddha laid out the direction for us to follow. And sometimes things happen, life happens. But the most important part is that we stay and we just follow the teachings. And we may want sometimes. Oh, I want to be here. It's just like if we're driving, we can't be like, oh, I want to be in New York, and then magically we're in New York. We still have to travel. We still have to do those things. And that's the way the practice is sometimes. We want to be in a certain place, but as long as we keep going in the right direction, the direction that the Buddha laid out, we will get there. The Buddha laid that out. So that's what I think we have to do sometimes, and just be comfortable with the uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, the really important thing is that we're going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily where we are, but rather that we're pointed in the right direction. That's the most important thing. And the way we know that is through the cultivation of right view. So I would say actually the number one important thing is read the suttas. Read the suttas and have Dhamma conversations with monks. And then based upon that, you will know the right direction. And as long as you're moving in the right direction, it doesn't actually matter how slowly you're moving.
Mm.
The important thing is that you're going in the right direction.
Yes.
It also doesn't matter where you are along the road, because as long as you're pointed in the right direction, you'll get there eventually. And you're going to go through a lot of very uncomfortable states between here and there, because every step along the path is as an unawakened being.
Yes.
So that means there's a lot of dukkha ahead of you. But you're moving in the right direction, and that's what's important.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah. And also, generally speaking, as you proceed along the path, then your dukkha will diminish step by step.
You get closer to your destination.
Yeah.
As long as you're heading in the right direction.
And Dharma Learner says, very excited to see Bhante Metiko tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Says, will you be at Empty Cloud during February if you plan that far ahead? Probably, you'll probably be here, but I mean, who knows? Everything is unpredictable.
We don't even know if Empty Cloud will be here in February.
Or tomorrow, for that matter. Or if any of us will be here in February.
But I hope to see you soon. Glad to see you on here.
Moraya says, if we notice an intention arise that seems to be rooted in a hindrance, is it skillful to do the opposite of that intention so we don't cultivate the hindrance, such as not eating if you notice greed? Well, food is a bit of a complicated matter because you have to eat in order to survive. So better is actually to change your attitude. So again, we have this food contemplation where we reflect, like, I'm using this food not for fun or for pleasure or for beauty, but instead to maintain the body and not cause any harm to it. So that's, and to support our spiritual practice. So that's it's switching our attitude. It's like, okay, I still have to eat, but I need to make sure I'm doing so with the right attitude. As for other behaviors, I mean, it really depends on what exactly it is. But yeah, generally speaking, if you notice your impulse to do something is rooted in an unwholesome motive, then you should stop and check yourself and see, is there actually a wholesome motivation for doing this? Well, then, okay. But if there really isn't, then just don't do it. And John says, are there techniques for cultivating virya in daily life? It's typically setbacks and relational issues that drain us, I think. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think what's helped me sometimes is, one, to look at the benefits of practicing, listening to the Dhamma, and that gives me energy. Right? Also, reflections on death. I mean, just as we just talked about, we don't know if we're going to be here tomorrow. That can give that extra spark sometimes, like, oh, like, I don't know how much time I have. Then that gives that energy to study. That gives that energy to practice sometimes. And then also looking at the benefit. It's easier sometimes, I'm so tired, I just want to sit on the couch and kind of veg out and watch TV or whatever. But then we reflect on the goodness that arises from our practice, from meditation, from chanting. And that can give energy sometimes when we reflect on the benefit. And also sometimes what helps me when I practice is I think of the benefit that there is for others. Oh, other people, I want to send merit to these people. I want my practice to be towards these people. So that gives me energy. Oh man, I want to just sit, I don't want to do anything. But then when I reflect on that, that gives me energy to do it. Reflection on depth, I think, is also, again, a spark sometimes.
Okay.
I don't know what to do.
That's good. Yeah. And Zach asks, which Nichiren sect is the least bossy and controlling?
I don't know what that is.
Well, I mean, the most well-known one outside of Japan is Soka Gakkai International, SGI. There's 2 other branches of Nichiren Buddhism in Japan, but you don't come across them very often outside of Japan. But there's actually a couple of them close by here, and they're actually quite nice. Yeah, I mean, I find I'm a little bit uncomfortable about saying which is the least bossy and controlling, because anything I say is going to sound like I'm talking badly about some form of Buddhism. I will say this, I have had quite pleasant interactions with the older, more traditional forms of Nichiren Buddhism. So Nichiren Shu and Nichiren Shoshu, these are the 2 older forms. They're pretty nice. Still not my favorite style of Buddhism, and I don't have much experience with it, so I can't actually talk in much detail about it. I'm much more comfortable talking about Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, but Nichiren I don't really have much to say. Moria says, when I had tried the Buddha mantra in the past, it made me feel kind of neurotic and like I was giving myself OCD thinking in a way. Is this a normal doubt or worry when taking up that practice? To be honest, I never liked that practice and I never did it much. I found other mantras more useful. One thing I found useful for quite some time was, this was a long time ago, so I don't remember the exact phrasing, but I think I was just repeating something like homage to Shakyamuni Buddha. And I would just repeat that over and over in my mind. And I found that incredibly delightful. But the actual like Thai thing of doing Buddha, 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 I never liked that one. Yeah, homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, yeah, that's nice. Namo Buddhaya is another one that's pretty short. It's also quite traditional and quite nice. Yeah, I mean, basically, if a particular practice really doesn't work for you, then don't do it. Do something else.
That's true. It's true, very true.
Okay, so Rick is saying, I watched a live stream by Bhante Rahula today, and I had a difficult time understanding the practices that help us become more aware of the rising and falling of mind moments. I think he said learning these practices will help us to embody the 3 characteristics. I think you should probably ask Bhante Rahula, because it's very difficult for me to comment on a teaching given by another teacher when I don't even know what specifically he was teaching. So I think you'd be better off asking him, ask him directly whatever you're unclear about. I mean, briefly speaking, every moment is a mind moment, and every moment has the nature of appearing and disappearing instantaneously. So just observing the constant change of one moment to the next will already give you some insight into this. But if you need more info on what Bhante Rahula was teaching, you'll have to talk directly to him. Nicole says, some friends are using psychedelics as a healing modality and complement to their meditation. I personally disagree with this practice. What is the best way to support them, but not the psychedelics? Well, look at what's good. Look at their good traits, their good qualities, their good practices, and praise those good things. For example, just to use a mundane example, if somebody makes 4 different kinds of food and you like 3 of them, then you don't need to tell them, oh, I liked all 4 of the food dishes that you made. You could even tell them, I like those 3. I wasn't a fan of that one. Monks don't normally say these things. We normally just gratefully accept everything without picking and choosing. But if somebody says like, well, which ones do you like? Which ones do you not like? You could tell them that. Or if you notice that somebody, say they do a project and 3 of their 4 projects turn out well, and the 4th one was a little bit messy and sloppy and not so good, well, then you can say, oh, those first 3 projects were really well done. I really appreciate what you did there. You don't even need to mention the 4th one. Just by the fact that it's excluded from your praising will already get the point across.
Yeah.
So you don't need to go up to them and say like, I disagree with your psychedelic usage. You need to stop right away. No, you just praise whatever you find praiseworthy about what they're doing, and let them figure out the rest on their own.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people will start to do those things that you're praising, and they'll notice, as Venerable said, like they'll notice you're not talking about the psychedelics. You never mention the psychedelics. So at the very least, they should stop mentioning that too. Right?
And also it's relatively common when people are in a phase of spiritual exploration. It's common that they'll go through a phase of psychedelic usage. Especially these days, it's quite common. And normally, once somebody settles on some kind of deep spiritual practice, then normally they will naturally stop using psychedelics, or they'll slow down and eventually stop. So I also think that, again, if you praise their spiritual practices, then over time, as they get more settled in their spiritual practice, then naturally the psychedelic use will diminish.
That's a good point.
Richard says, despite significant progress in meditation, lingering trauma-induced hypervigilance remains. How can I use this heightened awareness positively to enhance specific aspects of my practice? What are your thoughts?
Well, sometimes, and I don't know, like this specific case, like I hate to comment on something like this, but sometimes like we need to go talk to a mental health therapist. Like if there's some unresolved trauma or we're seeing this trauma, sometimes it helps to go talk to somebody about that and kind of work through that process. I'm not saying go talk to a therapist, you need to go talk to a therapist, but I think sometimes when we have a lot of trauma or it's really impacting us, it's helpful to talk to other people, and it can enhance our practice and let those aspects of our practice grow more.
Yeah. And Zach says, how do I ask a question or ask for their view? Well, you already asked a question and we already responded to it. So if you put in more questions, we'll respond to more questions. Note, though, that when there's a lot of questions and comments, then we'll normally skip the comments and just respond to the direct questions. So if you want a question answered, make sure it's phrased in the form of a question. And Rick says, what are skillful means when anxiety arises in meditation? And there's a lot of things that you can do. So one thing that can be useful is to observe the actual physical sensation of anxiety. What does it actually feel like in the body? So investigate it with a mind of curiosity and interest. What does it actually feel like? Like, oh, okay. Elevated heart rate, elevated breathing, increased blood pressure, sense of heat in the body. That's all perfectly normal stuff. If you go for a run, you'll get all of those symptoms. But when you go for a run, you don't have a problem. What is different? So as you become more aware of the body sensations, then you can accept that this is just how the body feels. And it's perfectly normal and natural that sometimes the body will feel like that. Sometimes your breathing is fast and shallow. That's okay. That's normal. Sometimes it's deep and slow. That's also okay. That's also normal. Sometimes your body feels hot, sometimes it feels cold. That's all normal. So whatever the physical symptoms of anxiety are, become intimately familiar with them and accepting of them. Then that clears up the physical side. So then looking, what's the mental component of anxiety? And normally the mental component of anxiety takes the form of runaway fearful thinking. Of course, this varies a bit from person to person, but most commonly that's the way it comes. But actually dealing with runaway thinking is one of the most like surface level things in meditation practice. So this is most of what we do is learning how to stabilize and focus the mind in this way. So actually just focusing intently on your meditation object is sometimes sufficient. Or deliberately creating positive thought patterns, as I mentioned before. Sometimes that will cut through the fearful thinking. Reflecting on your own goodness, reflecting on your own virtue, morality, generosity, your own commitment to a spiritual practice. These are all things which also can bring up a sense of ease and well-being in the mind. Thinking about the Buddha, how fortunate you are to have access to the teachings of the Buddha. So these are all examples of things that you can do. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, that's okay. What I would say.
Okay. And John says, is there a connection between repeating annoying thoughts? Thoughts are not annoying, by the way. Thoughts are just thoughts. Things are only annoying when you decide you hate them. So I think actually this is the first problem here, is that you've decided to hate some of the thoughts that appear in your mind. So that's why they're uncomfortable. It's because of your hatred toward those thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. So it's important also to accept that the nature of the mind is that it tends to produce a certain amount of background noise. So just accept that's the nature of the mind. Except in deep states of meditation, there will tend to be a certain amount of background noise in the mind. That isn't a problem. It's only a problem if we decide that we hate it. Then it becomes repeating annoying thoughts. But if we aren't bothered, we just accept that that's the nature of the mind, and we don't take those thoughts seriously, and we don't take them personally, and we don't react to them, and we don't participate in them, then even if those thoughts are coming and going, then they won't be a problem. They won't bother us. So then instead of repeating annoying thoughts, you'll have repeating non-problematic thoughts. So there'll be a lot of non-problems going around in the background, and that's not a problem, is it?
Noise.
Yeah. Kind of like the distant sound of a dehumidifier running, and it's like, well, okay, big deal. Or the sound of the wind blowing or the rain falling, and you're just like, yep, that's just how it is. Sometimes the wind blows and the rain falls. Well, it's the same with your mind. Sometimes there's like random thoughts appearing in the back of your mind. Okay, no big deal. Not a problem. Don't get involved, and there's no problem.
And like your advice that you've given to times to use humor, like, oh, that's kind of funny. That thought's coming up again. Instead of taking it so personal. It's not personal. It's just the mind. That's the way the mind's working. Oh, that's kind of funny. Yeah. Also, like your advice you've given too is taking that step outside, almost like, and looking at it like, wow, there's somebody else thinking so. Those are very helpful, I think. Have been helpful in my own practice. I think humor's so John's crazy. What is that thought doing here again? Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's actually hilarious. Just watching your own mind. It's just like, wow, what is all this crazy junk coming and going?
It can be a very good comedy if you let it.
Yeah. It's kind of like watching a nonsense movie, like a movie where the plot line doesn't make any sense. And yeah.
Right. You're just like, where did this come from?
Yeah. So he's asking, is there a connection between repeating annoying thoughts and the laziness of the mind? As in, the mind is just laying down to be inactive due to defilement. Based on what you said, cultivating a wholesome intention and following through could be protective. So yes, so sometimes when the mind feels lazy and dull, it's just because we don't want to face what's currently going on. So we try to escape our present moment experience by making the mind blurry and hazy. So often if you're spacing out or dozing off during meditation, often the problem is actually just that you just don't want to deal with what's currently going on in your mind. And so the mind tries to escape by slipping into cloudiness. So yeah, sometimes that's what's going on. So then it's necessary to actually directly confront the experience and just fully accept this is the nature of the mind. And there's no problem here. And also actively cultivate a curiosity and interest in the meditation practice. Something I found very interesting, I was talking to a monk many years ago, and she said that before she got into meditation, she had a huge problem with boredom. She would get bored very easily. And then she said, then she learned meditation and she got the instruction to carefully watch her own mind. And she said, I've never been bored since. And actually, it's true. When you actually take an interest in observing the arising and ceasing of mental objects, you're just like, wow, a never-ending source of entertainment. Great. And all I have to do is just sit down and stay awake. Wow.
Can be entertaining. Patient endurance with Kanti. I think that helps sometimes. Just watch, letting your thoughts go.
So John says, John has lots of questions this evening. That's good. Questions are what keeps the monk chat alive. John says, so my mind in meditation is observing Dhammas. The Buddha taught cultivating qualities of mind as I understand the teaching. Do I need to bridge observation and cultivation somehow? Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, we can talk about two major categories of meditation practice, passive methods and active methods. So sometimes passive methods are more useful, sometimes active methods are more useful. It depends upon your current condition of mind. So experiment with practices from both categories and observe when a more passive method is helpful and when a more active method is helpful. Okay, so Zach says, what do you think of the two children that offered mud pies to the Buddha and were reborn as the king and his consort of a Buddhist kingdom? I've never heard this story before. It's probably from one of the apocryphal bodies of literature. He continues, this is very similar to the act of offering a prayer stone to the Great Spirit once a year or more, a universal Native American spiritual custom. I have no familiarity with Native American spiritual customs, so I can't comment at all about that. I can only talk about Buddhism. He continues, I sense that the very first spiritual activity of man was the offering of his most valuable possession, his stone that was in hand. What do you think? I think that generosity is the foundation of Buddhist practice, and I think that generosity is one of the most important activities that we can do because it does, in fact, form the karmic foundation for progress in spiritual practice. And actually to neglect the practice of generosity is to neglect one's own spiritual growth. That's what I would say.
It lightens the heart and generosity, both for the giver and the receiver. That's one of the things I've noticed in my own practice, just how beautiful it is when someone is giving. And then also that idea of self as we give. Generosity, I mean, the Buddha emphasized generosity for a lot of reasons, and I think one of them is that idea of self. We want to keep things for ourselves. Oh, this is mine. But when we give it, it's really relinquishing that idea of self sometimes. So I think that can be very powerful. Generosity is very powerful. It's a very powerful part of the practice, and I think too often neglected, the aspect of generosity. Being generous to ourselves too.
And Scott says, can you please speak to the practice of chanting invitations to / calling the devas?
We were just talking about
that. Then you want to say a few words on it?
We were just talking about, I was just talking about how powerful, I gave an example, how powerful it can be sometimes, that invitation to the devas. In my own, just hearing it sometimes, I've almost felt like crying sometimes. The power of just knowing we're inviting the devas to come, to listen to these paritas. It can be so powerful. Such a moving thing, I think, sometimes. And was it last week that you gave a talk about Devanussati, reflecting the Devas? So I think that's part of the practice. The invitation to the Devas is reflecting on the power of the Devas. I find it very, very moving.
Yeah, also I find it useful at times to recollect that we're constantly in the company of these delightful angelic beings. And if we call to them, then they might take notice of us. So most people have a hard time seeing them. Most people don't have clear communication with them. But they're always here. They're always around us. And we can align ourselves with them. We can come into connection with them. And a lot of them really appreciate good, wholesome, moral people. They really appreciate kind, friendly people. They really appreciate calm, accepting people. So naturally, they tend to like sincere Buddhist practitioners. So it's actually quite common that Buddhist monasteries, at least you'll hear this said often, that Buddhist monasteries usually have a little host of devas, a little host of angels that hang out at the monastery or in the vicinity of the monastery. And some places you can feel something, like you walk into a monastery and there's just this like bright, warm tingling in the air. And you're just like, there's something going on here.
And with that, I always feel like when the invitation to the Devas, the ones that maybe they're there, they're not, they're involved in something else. They might not be listening, but when that invitation goes out, they're like, oh, I need to pay attention. They're calling me. That's I find that really powerful. It's not just the Devas that are there; it's the Devas that might be involved in something else. And all of a sudden, they hear that invitation. I love it.
Okay, and Rick says, during meditation, my body can be relaxed while I still feel stress in the head. What are ways we can let go of the muscle tightness in the jaw, tongue, and face? Actually, one thing which helps tremendously is to give up on getting rid of the tension in your face. Just accept this is how the face feels. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, who said that tension is bad? Like, if your body loses all tension, you die. Like, the only time your body is completely relaxed is when it's dead. Like, who decided that tension is inherently bad? Like, it's just the nature of the body. The body always has a certain amount of tension. That's just part of its life process. So, and actually having a certain amount of tension doesn't necessarily mean your meditation is going badly. It just means there's a certain amount of tension. That's literally all it means. So just accept, so you feel some tightness in your jaw? Okay, make friends with that sensation. Be like, oh, hello, tightness. Oh, nice to meet you. Yeah, you can stay here. It's fine. No problem. You're welcome here too. So have that sense of kindness and welcoming towards the sensation of tightness. It doesn't need to be a problem. And then, ironically, what will tend to happen is as you do this, then you'll tend to relax a bit more. But starting with this just complete acceptance, like, okay, my body feels tense. Okay, no problem. Welcome, tension. You can be here too.
I've used that sometimes in attention as mindfulness of the body, like, oh, there's tension here. And then I'll direct my attention, as you say, once you bring that attention to that spot, and then also looking at the impermanence of it, seeing it kind of fade and move. And sometimes, as you say, just bringing that attention to it will cause that tension to kind of ease and release. I've also brought metta into those parts. Oh, there's a lot of tension here. And then the feeling of metta into that spot.
Yeah. So Zach says, I am of the belief that the very first spiritual activity of man was the offering of a prayer stone to the mystery. Okay. I'm usually more interested in what I can do right now. So rather than speculating about possible events in distant history, instead the question is, what can I do right now that will make me a better person right now? That's more interesting to me. So if for you, offering prayer stones makes you a better person, great, keep doing it. But speculating about the distant possible past is not usually that useful. And also from a Buddhist perspective, there is no first point anyway. Time is beginningless. So you can't actually ever find the first spiritual activity because there never was a first one. And it's beside the point anyway, because the better question is, what can I do right now that will make me a better person? That's the important question. Oh, we've got a big one here. It looks like Metiko's already renounced this question. So TJ says, would you explain the concept of nirvana in early Buddhism and its significance in the spiritual journey? How much time do you have? Because we don't have very much. Certainly not enough to do this question justice. Actually, that would be a whole Dhamma talk. Actually, maybe Vanda, if you could put this on the list. I can give a talk on the subject next week. Yeah, TJ will give a full-length answer to your question as a Dhamma talk next week.
There you go, TJ.
Yeah, there is no concise answer. I mean, I could give a concise answer, but it would be dukkha. Briefly, nirvana is the absence of dukkha. So there's your brief answer. It's the complete absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. There's your short answer. But to talk about it properly will take it at least 15 minutes or so. So next week.
It's a good subject for a long time.
John says, how can I communicate with devas? Can it be learned?
The way to communicate with devas is continuing to be a good person, following the precepts, kindness and generosity. And the devas will know. That's
yeah.
The devas recognize, as Bhante earlier said, they recognize goodness. There are certain devas that they see the goodness and they're attracted to that goodness. That's how we communicate. Simply, yeah.
Okay, and that's the last question. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.